So let's go through that. As usually, we are keeping the same release cadence. So we are doing 4 major releases every year. The last one that we released at the end of June is CloverDX 6.1, and the next one will be 6.2 towards the end of the September. We are, of course, doing bug fixes in between, depending on the needs when we discover bugs or when the bugs are reported. If you have any questions about our releases, please head to our releases page where you can find full release notes and more details about all the changes that are part of each release. For this release, few highlights from release notes, what I will be talking about. The first and the biggest feature that we introduced in this release is custom validation in Wrangler that allows you to build your own validation rules or use the rules that we already provide as part of the product to validate your data as you're processing it in Wrangler. Together with this, you can then collect all kinds of information about data that failed your validation, and I'll show you what it looks like a little bit later. Of course, we improved the transformation functionality in Wrangler, so there are new steps that you can use to work with your data. We've also made a lot of smaller improvements that help you work with the user interface in general. We also made a lot of improvements in libraries, namely OAuth 2 connections can now be managed from server completely, so you don't need to have the designer to authorize the connection. This is something that will help you for sure during the installation of the libraries, and the permission system is now a bit more complete. It looks a little bit more than what you have available in sandboxes, so you can control permissions to greater granularity in this release. We also made it easier to share your work you do in Wrangler. You can easily export any job that you've created, including its data sources and targets, and import it in another instance of Wrangler or in the same instance with a different user. So this will make collaboration between different users or multiple different users easier. And as I mentioned, you can see full release notes on our website with additional details about what was changed. For those who have not seen our previous webinar covering CloverDX 6, we've had a major version change, so there were a lot of improvements or a lot of changes in the previous release. So I would like to just recap that so that you are kind of in the picture for what's new. The biggest change that we've introduced in CloverDX 6 was introduction of a completely new way of working with data in Clover. We've introduced what we call data self-service for everyone, part of the platform that's embodied in Wrangler and data catalog that help less technical users work with their data directly. So you no longer have to ask your IT to implement the jobs for you, but rather you can look into data catalog, grab the data that the IT team published for you, and work with it directly in Wrangler without having to install any client, because everything is powered by a web interface that you can easily just log into from any compatible browser. Of course, everything else that was in the platform stayed and was upgraded to newer versions, so you can automate your workloads just as you were able to do before. Clover still is a single platform that you can use to manage all your workloads, whether they are simple or more complex. And given the automation and the power of the platform, you can increase productivity of your team and trust in the data that your team is producing. The deployment model stayed the same as well, so you can deploy in cloud, on-premise, or hybrid, depending on what you need, just like you were able to do before. If you have any more questions about this, please ask either during this webinar or have a look at our previous one where we explain the differences between 5X version of Clover and 6.0 in more detail. Now, let's talk about the features that are new in 6.1. The first and the biggest one is or revolves around the validation. Of course, data quality and in general data validation is something that bothers pretty much everyone. And whenever we talk with our users, this is one of the top 3 things that they mention when they are working with their data, regardless of whether the source is something that people enter into a system or whether the data is produced by some automated process. The data quality is always top of their minds because it can cause quite a lot of delays or issues when not done correctly. So with this release, we are introducing completely new functions in Wrangler that allow you to increase confidence in your data by allowing you to run validation rules that check all kinds of aspects of your data. So you can very easily verify whether for example, the input data that you are reading from any system that you connect to Wrangler matches the requirements that you have for the data. You can also validate your data as you process that to ensure that whatever calculations you are making still are producing the data as you expect. This also allows you to discover issues early and even fix them automatically. In many cases, you can, for example, fix the formatting of the data or parse the data in a slightly different way, which helps you work with your data in more complete fashion in Wrangler. I'll show you what it looks like on a demo in a couple of minutes so that you can see how it works and how it can simplify your life. Technically, this is implemented in a few different ways. We added the ability to run what we call validation steps. They can be either user-defined through generic step we call validate with formula, or you can use one of the pre-built validation steps that are part of the release, like validate email, credit card, phone number, and so on, that help you validate more complex data, like emails and similar. Once your data is validated, all the information that Wrangler collected about the error, for example, whether the email was invalid or phone number, all of that information gets collected in what we call a reject file, which you can then download and share with others. And oftentimes, the invalid data doesn't come from the system that you maintain, but comes from someone else. So you can easily send the report of validation issues to whoever is your contact in the source system, and they can either look into that or try to correct data in their platform in some way. And again, I'll show you what the file looks like. A quick screenshot from the platform. You'll see this in action in a couple of minutes. The second set of features revolve around the transformation functionality in Wrangler. We've added new transformation steps to help you manipulate your data in Wrangler. For example, there are a few date manipulation steps that allow you to subtract dates so that you can find how far the dates are apart from each other. You can query part of a date and so on. You can work with text and standardize your text in better ways compared to previous release by, for example, cleaning white spaces or turning your text into proper case. Masking is an interesting step that we added. It's the first data anonymization step in Wrangler, which is something that we'll continue doing in the future releases, and it can help you very easily hide data that you don't want to share with others. For example, you can mask parts of phone numbers or names and so on. We've made dozens of smaller improvements in other existing steps, like, for example, delete columns can now delete many columns at once. It behaves differently. It doesn't fail anymore when the column is not part of your data set, so it helps you deal with schema evolution over time and so on. It's now also possible to duplicate steps so that you can easily save the work that you have and don't have to pre-configure the step or configure the second step in the same way, which can take quite a while for complex setups. And again, I'll show you what it looks like on a real transformation. You can also easily share the work that you do in Wrangler. It's simple to export your jobs. There's a context menu right away in the My Jobs screen that allows you to export the job and share it with someone else. And it will give you a zip file that you can send via email or some sort of chat application, upload to any place where you want, and import it somewhere else through the same screen. There's an import button. This allows you to transfer not only job settings as in the transformation within the job, but also settings for the data sources and data targets. So essentially copying the whole setup so that you transfer the whole thing to a different instance of Wrangler or to a different user of the Wrangler. We've also made many improvements in libraries that help you power the data catalog. The biggest ones are the ability to manage OAuth2 connections directly in the server. Before this release, you had to have a designer to authorize OAuth2 connection within the library, which made deployments of new libraries more complex than really necessary. So with this new release, you can simply deploy a new library, and any connection that's part of the library will be shown in the configuration, and you can authorize through a very simple user interface that allows you to enter all the requirements for the auth to push the button, and it takes you to the auth to authorization flow. All of that is done within the server without any requirements for connecting the project or the library to a designer. We also improved the permissions model. that allows you to work with libraries in more complete ways. So we can now control permissions in 2 different levels. On one level, you can do similar setup like you can do for sandboxes, where you control access to the whole library per user group. And you can then also do granular or more granular permission setup on a connector level, which ties to how Wrangler and Data Catalog see the libraries. So together, this allows you to configure quite complex permission settings for every user of the platform, whether they are using the designer, in which case the global permissions apply to them, or whether they are using Data Catalog and Wrangler, in which case they can take advantage of the connector level permissions. As usually, we've made platform updates to bring Clover up to speed with various libraries and developments in Java world. So we have now completely transitioned to Java 11. So you can no longer run CloverDX 6.1 on any Java 8. Currently, the table on the screen shows what we call stacks. So for each application server, we have preferred Java version or Java release. The most common one being Apache Tomcat with Eclipse Xamarin Java, but you can see that all of them are Java 11. It's no longer possible to run Clover with Oracle JDK 8 like it was possible before. We will be continuing to expand this, and we are planning to support Java 17 within next 2 releases also. So on top of Java 11, we'll add support for Java 17 for everyone who's looking for new features regarding new Java versions. There are, of course, many other changes within the platform. For example, we introduced 2 new CTL functions that mimic the steps, proper case and normalized white spaces. So you can do same kind of data normalization within your Clover graphs or Clover jobs. We improved job tracking for Wrangler jobs, so you can now very easily see the summaries of how much data was processed by your Wrangler jobs. You can also download the files from within the execution history in server UI, so you no longer have to go to Wrangler to do that if you are server administrator. And another change for server admins is that we've disabled audit log by default. This log track all kinds of activities that users were doing and duplicated all kinds of information from other log files. So by default, this is now disabled. You can easily enable it in server settings by configuring the server audit property. So that's it as far as slides go. Let's have a look at the demo. I'll talk about the validation first, because as I mentioned, this is the biggest feature that we have. So the first change you'll notice is on the My Jobs screen, which looks different because now there are different statuses compared to what we had before. Each job can complete, but before we only were allowing you to complete the job fully or ignore data that didn't go through validation in Wrangler. Right now, what happens is that you can actually configure your job to collect information about roles that did not match validation rules that you configured or the built-in rules within Wrangler, and they are all written into what we call a reject file. And this is the information that helps you figure out whether there were any rejects in your data or not. Clicking on this will get you to a new status page for finished jobs, which shows you a quick overview of where the issues lie. So you can easily see, for example, which steps produced the validation errors. Right? These are different steps in my job that I'll show you in a moment, and I can see how many validation failures happened in that step. You can also do this per column so that you can see how many values are not valid in each column of your data set. For example, in here, I can see that there are 6 invalid exchange rates in my data set. This is often very useful if you want to see whether the data set that you have is valid right away from the source. Usually you want to validate your data at the beginning so that you can very quickly catch records that that are invalid. Of course, you can copy this summary and paste it into an email very easily. It will format nicely. And you can also click on different steps to take you to the editor so that you can see which step actually captured the error. In my case, this is the step that's at the end, right? Because there are many validation errors raised through the transformation itself. So this one captures quite a lot of them at the end. But we can have a look at the validation steps themselves. For example, this allows me to test whether my invoice numbers are valid. Right? I do not allow empty values there, and I can validate that using one of the new steps called validate using formula, which allows me to very easily discover which values are invalid. I can see that, for example, there's another one in here. I do the same thing with due date and few more, right? I have few more steps to validate my data as I go through my transformation. And you'll see that as I do this, it will also kind of cascade down, because when I try to use something that's in error in a calculation, it will of course make the result of the calculation invalid. So in this way, you can very easily see where the invalid data propagates, or how the invalid data propagates through your transformation. And for example, if I go towards the end and see at the end result and scroll to the top where I have the most errors, I can see that these errors actually have been caused by a single thing. When I tried to do calculation with invalid currency, I cannot compute exchange rate because I don't have that, and the same, I cannot compute the new amount in US dollars because I don't have the exchange rate. So it's very easy to kind of tie your errors to a single error message, and you can then of course see the results and summary in the reject file, which is the second part of this, right? So we've seen the steps and what it looks like in the editor, but the summaries is also something that you won't look typically at first, right? So if this is not enough information for you and you need more detail, you can always have a look at the reject file, which will have the same format as the output from your job. So if you produce Excel files, the reject will be in Excel as well. If you are writing CSVs, the reject file will be CSV format too. So let's have a look at the Excel version of the file. Just wait for it to open. Just give me a second, it opened on the second screen here. All right, so this is the reject file. And then it gives me a complete information about what was the issue. For example, in here, I can see that invoice currency was invalid, which is my customer error message. Exchange rate wasn't calculated because the currency was unknown or empty, and so on, right? So all the errors that I have on a single row are collected in a single row of the output, and I can also see the data that caused that, right? So this is the data that I have in the output, and I can easily see that my currency is empty, so it wasn't provided, and I cannot do any lookups when the currency is not there, and so on. So this kind of information allows you to quickly capture what's wrong with your data, see where it was raised, in which step. You can see which columns are affected by your errors, and of course, more detailed error message. And this, since this is a file that you can download, you can very easily share it with anyone who might be involved in the process of working with the data set that you have, or maybe who owns the source system from which the data originates, so that they can attempt to fix it before you rerun the job. So let's close this. Of course, in many cases, you'll have, just like I have here, you'll have some rejects in a reject file, but you can also have your valid data. In my case, I configured the job to not fail, so rejected records are fine for me, and I can download my results just like before. Right? So this is the output of my transformation, which will contain about 1,100 rows. And so these are all the valid records that passed all the validation rules in my job. This is something that you can configure the same way like you were able to do that before. When you look into the target settings, this is what changes the behavior of the job. Either you configure it to write rows with errors into a reject file. This is the default option. Or if you configure it this way, the job will fail. And in many cases, you want the job to fail because you can't allow any invalid data, or the whole data set must be valid for it to actually make sense. And this is what happens when you do that, right? You get an error message that depends on what the validation rules you run, and it will tell you which record was invalid, and it will also tell you the validation message, which depends on the rule itself. So this is the data validation. As I mentioned, there are also new steps. One of the steps that I mentioned is the masking. So let's have a look at that, because it's a quite interesting step. This is a step that allows me to easily mask data in different ways. Right? This is my original data set containing phone numbers. And I decide to share that with someone, but I don't want to share full phone numbers, just want to show them that they are there. So this is what I can do. I can mask the data using all kinds of settings in here that allows me to, for example, mask just digits so that the plus and parentheses remain the same. I can also mask letters and so on. Depending on what my data is, I can configure this to mask different parts of my data so that it's still recognizable as certain data type, but no longer valid or no longer provides any personal information that that I don't want to share with whoever is the recipient of this of this output. There are many options for what you can do with this, so I'm sure that you'll be able to use this to great effect when you want to work with personal data in your jobs. Apart from that, we've added, as I mentioned, validation steps that can be easily accessed from context menu of each column. So you can do validate. Well, I don't have any email in here, but we can do validate phone number. That will be very easy in here. And region. All right, so let's do it like this. And since these are randomly generated phone numbers, most of them will be invalid, which you can see that pretty much the whole data set turned red. But this, in case of phone number validation, it understands the format of phone numbers. Even if you don't use it so nicely formatted as this, it will parse the number, and it understands the rules for different countries. So it can parse numbers from the whole world. The same is true for credit cards. We can validate credit card numbers using their check digits. So it's not just validating that they have the number of digits that you would normally expect, but rather it's actually calculating the checksum. For emails, it's the same. We validate email not just on the basic level where we just look for the @ symbol, but we actually also validate against the most common rules that many email providers enforce, like, for example, no spaces in the email and so on, so that you can be sure that that the email looks valid before you try to do something with it. I also mentioned that we have new steps that work with strings. The first one is proper case. Sorry, so it's this one. It's probably not going to do anything in here. And we also have the cleanup of white spaces, which again will not do anything interesting in here, but it allows you to work with text that usually contains multiple lines or tab characters and so on, and cleans it up nicely for you so that you can very easily work with it, especially if you are working with REST APIs. It's quite useful. Moving on to the server, I mentioned that we've implemented several improvements in libraries. So I'll start with the OAuth connections. As you can see, I have multiple libraries in here, and one of them that that works with ClickUp requires, this one requires auth2 connection, which can be configured like this. This is a completely new part of the UI that wasn't there before, which allows you to enter client ID, secrets, and all the scopes and everything else that you need for your connection. And if you want to authorize it, you can easily click in here, which will open a pop-up window or redirect you depending on what you need. And this is implemented in the application that you connect to. In my case, I'm doing ClickUp, so I can easily connect my workspace, and it will authorize the connection. After I do this, the connection is authorized, and I can use it just like any other auth2 connection within the library. So this allows me to deploy and install new libraries very easily without having to have access to the designer. The second part that we've improved are the permissions. Actually, let's open something that has more. So the library level permissions are a new part of this user interface. This allows me to configure permissions in similar manner that I can do for sandboxes. So I can easily add a group, for example, support, and add them different permissions. In my case, this is not going to do much because I already allow full access to everyone, but you can do more granular. If I remove this part, I will be able to configure access per group. What's interesting is that you can see that I've just made the configuration invalid because I've removed access from everyone, and yet I mandate that for data source connectors. So it will warn me, and the configuration is validated real time as you make changes to it. So it will not allow you to save configuration that will result in a library being inaccessible to everyone or somehow conflicting between these two parts of the setup. So let's restore that so it's actually usable. The second thing we've implemented, as I mentioned, is the more comfortable view of the tracking data for Wrangler jobs. I can, for example, click on this one, and this is a new part of the UI that very easily allows you to see how much data was processed by a job. You can see the number of records, whether some of them were rejected, how many were written to the output, how many were received by the target, and so on. You can also download the files if your job works with files, and if it works with connectors, it looks different. This one, sorry, this one works with connector, right? So this is a connector. You cannot download that because it connects to something else, but you can always download the output. It will take you to the Wrangler home, where you can see the file, see the size, manage the file as you can normally within Clover.